Okay, Trent, I think we will shift gears, maybe move on from nutritional strategies to enhanced recovery to talk about another modality of recovery that has really taken off over the last 5 to 10 years, and that's hydrotherapy. We now know that a variety of sport institutes have hydrotherapy facilities. We have them here. Cold water, warm water, immersion, contrasts, used in training, used in competition. Maybe let's just talk about a little bit, maybe what's the rationale for using cold water immersion or cold warm contrast immersion post-training. Let's start there.
Sure. First, I'll preface this whole area by saying that there's actually very little research. There's a lot of anecdotal, a lot of discussion, a lot of positive feedback from athletes that consistently use it. But there is a very little research. The Australian Institute of Sport has led the charge recently with some newer information that we can bring out. I know that you guys have done a bit of work, so maybe you can bring that out later as well. But the whole rationale and idea during a hard training phase, during a general prep phase, or leading into a specific prep, in terms of hydrotherapy, is that second phase of the fatigue system is trying to lower muscle temperature to decrease some of the inflammatory responses, decrease muscle damage. It's like when you have an injury and you're icing something. It's a very similar approach, but it's more of a whole body. If you're training in the heat, it's a slightly different thing, and you use a cold water immersion. Yes, you're getting peripheral muscle cooling and decreased inflammation, but if it's cold enough and if it's hot enough and there's a big enough of a gradient, then obviously athletes come out cooling down or adjusting their core temperature as well, which might help later with sleeping and allow recovery that way as well. So you asked a question as well about contrast therapy.
Yeah, it's probably too big a question.
Yeah, so the contrast therapy, the idea there is to move back and forth between a cold tub and a hot tub in a 1-to-1 ratio every 1 to 2 minutes. So 2 minutes in one, 2 minutes in the other, 2 minutes in one, 2 minutes in the other. The idea there is that you might get some vasoconstriction in the cold tub, so a decrease in blood flow, and you might get a vasodilation in the warm tub, so an increase in blood flow, and perhaps cause some kind of a flushing mechanism of some of the toxins and things like that.
So some people believe that you'll remove metabolic waste products that have accumulated in the muscle after exercise.
Is there strong scientific evidence for that? Not that I'm aware of.
No.
It also, it depends on the time of the year too. If it's 2 Celsius and raining and you have a really skinny endurance athlete coming out from riding the bike for 3 hours and they're freezing,
don't put them in the cold tub.
I might start them for 5 minutes in the warm tub and then say, okay, let's start a 2 on 2 off, cold tub, hot tub, cold tub, hot tub. But we'll even finish in the warm tub again.
So in that case, you're stimulating changes in peripheral blood flow.
Blood flow, exactly.
Back and forth.
Now, I think you guys have some data that you've used, internal blood flow and temperature monitors.
Yeah, we put a temperature probe right into the quadriceps and then looked at a variety of different strategies in hydrotherapy, and one just being constant 10 minutes of immersion in about 15 degrees Celsius water, and you just see muscle temperature drop by about 10 degrees over that 10 minutes. And then if you don't get into a warm bath, it'll stay low for up to an hour and a half. So in terms of controlling inflammation and reducing muscle temperature as a trigger for enhanced recovery, maybe the best method is to use, say, 10 minutes straight. But even if you use very short contrasts of 1 to 2 minutes between hot and cold tubs, you still see that actually muscle temperature basically goes down. Because the gradient between muscle temperature in the cold water, or skin temperature in the cold water, is so big. So you suck heat out of the body, even using intermittent exposure to cold and warm tubs.
That's interesting.
So it's interesting, but what we don't have is the evidence actually that really enhances recovery.
Yeah.
We have to rely on other studies that have tried to demonstrate that. And as you mentioned, Trent, there's probably been less than 30 studies that have looked at
Yes.
this. I think you're familiar with the literature on that.
Pretty familiar, and I think I would say only 1 or 2 studies that have done it over, say, a 6 to 8 week period to look at whether these acute bouts of hydrotherapy can enhance or detract from training adaptation. So there's not a lot of information there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But I guess if you look at those studies as a whole, by and large, what you see is that there's very little evidence of a negative effect.
Right.
Maybe there's one study that has demonstrated it could impair training adaptation.
Yeah.
And that's caused a lot of furor, I guess,
Yes.
in the sport community. Should we be using hydrotherapy post-exercise? You look at all the other studies, there are either really no effect or possible benefits.
Yeah. So there was a very good meta-analysis, which is basically where you take all the studies, put them together and do a complete analysis of the totality of the data. And that came out last year. And there is this one outlier study, and this one outlier study has caused a lot of people, a lot of institutes to say, wow, maybe that inflammatory stage is needed to drive and tell the muscle to adapt.
Right.
That one study, they only had 6 subjects. They weren't elite athletes. They used a very aggressive cold tub routine. I think it was 2 times 15 minutes in the tub at 5 Celsius.
Yeah, very cold as well.
Very cold.
Yeah.
Very aggressive. And then their performance test was hand grip exercise. Hand grip's not in the Olympics, so I'm not sure of the validity of that performance test per se.
Right.
It's an interesting data set. Maybe I believe it because of the aggressiveness of it, but we certainly aren't that aggressive. I know other institutes aren't as well. We try to target no more than 15 minutes in a tub at one time, and we're between 12 and 15 Celsius on our cold.
Yeah, and I think the other point is that what that study does show is that, yes, it is possible to impair adaptation. So you do need to think about when and how you use hydrotherapy.
Yes. When, how, and the type of athlete.
The type of athlete.
Yeah. So I can tell you anecdotally that some marathon runners I work with, they're running 220 to 250K a week. And when this study came out 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and I showed the coach, he said, even if that's what's happening, we're still doing it. Marathon runners, obviously, that 250 to 260K a week is going exclusively through their quads. They aren't swimming. They're weight dependent.
Yeah.
And he said they can run probably 10 to 15% more volume because of muscle damage.
So the benefits outweighed any potential negative aspects of that, and so I guess the point is that hydrotherapy can be very, very, very beneficial in allowing athletes to continue to push themselves to train at high volumes and intensities.
Correct.
But be careful about overusing it. You shouldn't be using it probably every day after a workout. Right?
No, exactly. I agree with that.
I know we use it maybe once to twice a week after a 2 or 3 day hard training block to, just start the recovery day that's inserted in a microcycle, as an example.
Totally, and I think there's ebbs and flows to training within a week, within a month, within a cycle. And I know the Australian Institute of Sport is now going to have a look at cognitive and mental aspects, because there is something soothing and calming about water. Yeah. And I don't know if that has to do with the fact that we're in an aqueous environment for the first 9 months of when we're in mom's belly or what, but there's something soothing about that, and athletes do tend to feel refreshed after a hydrotherapy protocol. So
yeah, certainly they all seem to like it.
Yes.
And then it's something that they actually ask for and want. So we want to talk physiological about hydrotherapy for a little bit. We've talked about temperature.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned 12 to 15 degrees, even up to 20 degrees is acceptable. You don't have to be too cold. At first when this stuff started to happen, Trent, I think people were jumping into ice baths.
Like with cubes of ice and ice tubs.
I know I was guilty of making
colder the better.
Absolutely.
I think we've backed off that now and realized that when you think about body temperature and 37, and you think about water temperature, as long as you're in that 10 to 15, maybe even 20 Celsius range, it's still quite a bit of a gradient difference.
Yeah, skin temperature being 33 degrees, even if the water's 20 degrees, that's a 13-degree difference that sucks heat out of the body.
Exactly. Yeah. So that works.
What about the depth? The depth of immersion. I think because the other aspect of hydrotherapy is when you go in water, you have hydrostatic pressure that pushes on the body. What happens there?
So the mechanism of what's causing some of these favorable recovery profiles or favorable adaptation over, using it 2 or 3 times a week over a couple of months, the mechanism is not exactly nailed down. Is it the temperature of the water itself, or is it the depth of the water? So a lot of the studies that have come out, as I said earlier, from the Australian Institute of Sport, but they don't have tubs that you sit in. All of their entire hydrotherapy center that they have at the AIS features standing tubs.
Right.
And so, done a quick calculation before this podcast, if you're sitting in water, in terms of millimeters of mercury or torr, you're probably getting somewhere around pressure of around 50.
Yeah.
But if you're standing down at the ankles, you're getting a pressure of close to 100 torr.
So you double it.
You double it. Yeah. And there's a lot of ideas, some work out of NASA showing that these differences in pressure can also cause vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and perhaps better lymph drainage and all these other recovery processes that might take place. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done looking at whether it's just the water temperature, whether it's the pressure, or whether it's a combination of the two that are driving some of these positive.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to think about. And certainly, we're doing this interview here on Vancouver Island. We're surrounded by ocean, and I know a lot of the endurance athletes actually head to the ocean, especially during the summer, where they want to recover afterwards, and they might just wade into the neck. So you don't need a recovery tub necessarily to achieve this effect. You can get up to the neck. You have 120 millimeters of mercury pressure at the feet. Could be quite beneficial. So think about depth. Think about temperature.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Just as a comparison factor, maybe you know the number better than I do. Most compression garments that you put on, do you know the torr there?
I believe it's around 15 to 20 maximum. Right. So it's a
5
fraction.
times. Water to the neck is 5 times more pressure than your typical socks that you might wear.
Exactly. So using water is a really great strategy if indeed hydrostatic pressure can reduce inflammation, can cause fluid shifts, can even have some endocrine responses that may enhance recovery. But I guess as we've talked about, seems to work. Athletes seem to like it. The evidence scientifically is still emerging, but on the balance of it, I guess we would say, not a bad strategy to insert where it makes sense.
I agree, and I think, excuse the pun, I was lukewarm about using hydrotherapy aggressively prior to a conference that both you and I attended in November.
Yeah.
And then some of our Australian Institute of Sport colleagues, they presented some new research there on a training study that they did, and they found quite favorable outcomes in the group that used hydrotherapy 3 times a week compared to a group that didn't use any. And there were cyclists training very, very hard, and they had good performance outcomes and good performance measures. And I came away from that conference feeling a little more confident that in athletes that are training really hard, they're requesting it. Let's use it 2 or 3 times a week. I don't see the negative aspects of that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think interestingly, there's other technologies that are emerging outside of hydrotherapy, and maybe this is a good time just to very briefly talk about technologies such as the Normatec or even the Game Ready system, which puts some compression onto the limbs, and you can pump the compression up to about 30 millimeters of mercury. Right. Many athletes are using that system or the Game Ready, which is maybe more of an injury management system where you can combine cold and compression. Nevertheless, you're able to, if you don't have access to water, put some compression or have some temperature perturbation into the system. It's smaller.
It's smaller.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like, it's probably been, 50 years that if you sprain your ankle, you give it RICE.
Yes.
Rest, ice, compression, elevation. And we're still on these same topics 50 years later, just using expensive toys to, I shouldn't say expensive toys. I think there's some validity in there. We just have to do more research and more work on really nailing down the recovery aspect versus a psychological aspect versus what have you. So yeah, basically these Normatecs are just pants that you can put on, or you can put them on a limb or like the arm and plug them in, and you can pump up the pressure, and it can oscillate, and it can do different things. So
yeah, a very interesting technology. Stay tuned on that one, I
yes,
guess.
Exactly.
We're certainly using it and experimenting with it.
For sure.
Well, maybe now is a good time. I think we could go on and talk about a variety of other recovery modalities, but just to sort of recircle and get your final comments perhaps on inserting recovery into a taper period. And that very acute preparation phase right before a major competition. I mean, I guess, reading between the lines of our conversation, that's a time when recovery could be very important, or when you have back-to-back races or events with limited recovery time. Maybe if you could just give us a couple comments on that, and,
sure.
And then we'll finish up after that.
So I think there's kind of two concepts there to your question. One is in the 2 to 3 weeks prior to a major competition in the taper phase, and then one is rounds or heats at a competition.
Yes, exactly.
So in terms of the taper, for sure, at that period of the year, physiologically and psychologically, athletes want to start feeling fresher and less fatigued, to allow those fitness gains to come through and allow performance to increase. So being more aggressive with recovery routines at that period is generally a good thing, and generally a positive and emphasized, but there can be situations during the taper where you have to be careful. For example, most tapers feature a 40 to 60% reduction in training load, training volumes. And if you're a weight-dependent upright marathon runner who's used to eating a certain amount or using a certain amount of nutritional recovery or a certain amount of calories, they have to be sure to offset some of their eating to the decreased training load, because it's very easy to eat the same and recover the same and then gain 1 or 2 kilos.
We don't want fat marathoners, so
you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. That's a really good point. As training volume drops during taper phase, obviously you need to reduce the caloric intake.
And there's a few good studies showing that we don't actually self-select to do that. We have to self-select to do that. We don't just habitually know to switch portion sizes and plate sizes.
Yeah, so. Funny that, I used to be a runner. I've been tapering now for 20 years, and I'm living and walking proof of that theory, Trent.
Yeah. And it's easy to track. Just do a morning weigh-in. Yeah. And just kind of track weight over time. And it probably, a 1 or 2% body weight shifts are normal. Anything more than 1.5% consistently is a little red flag up or down during a taper. Just let's nail this a little closer.
I know Inigo Majika did a presentation at a conference a couple months ago. He's talking about taper, and obviously the idea of taper is shedding fatigue and reducing the negative consequences of training. The other concept that he's been promoting, which I really like, is setting up for some extra training. You're better rested. You can maybe perform training at a higher intensity. Just push a little bit beyond what you can normally do when you're fatigued because of general training. And I guess if you think about taper as an opportunity to bump adaptation even a little bit more, then maybe using things like hydrotherapy more aggressively in that phase of the competitive year might make sense, Trent.
Totally. So you might do a 2-phase taper where a month out from a major championship, you bring the training down for just a few weeks. And then maybe 2 weeks out, you hit a last 3 or 4 day phase really hard.
Good quality training.
Good quality. Yep. The athlete can do things that they've never done before. So not only physiologically is it interesting, but psychologically, they're going into the event feeling
you're putting them in a good place.
Amazing. But then during that period, you'd want to be very careful to think about maybe use hydrotherapy every day.
Right on.
Maybe you're really on top of the nutrition and the sleep and all the other things and the health treatments, massage and chiro and everything else. And then you would then follow maybe with another short 7 to 10 day taper leading into the championship. And there's mathematical modeling showing this should work. And I know coaches don't like mathematical modeling, but
no.
I think conceptually the way we just describe it makes some sense.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's an important consideration, an important thing for coaches to try in competitions leading up to major competitions. See how that works. Practice that strategy. So maybe
your one other question was in competition.
Yeah,
right?
Within competition.
Recovery cycles within a competition, and I think nowadays in the modern sports world, you know what your schedule is going to be months, years out. It's very important to try and mimic that in training now and again. So it's not a new cycle where to mimic as you go through the rounds, what access you will have to recovery modalities is completely different at your training site than at the Olympics. You might not have access to a bike right away. You might not have access to cool down equipment right away. You really need to mimic that in training so that it's not all, you aren't implementing some foreign recovery routine at a championship because of the limitations of security and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. So you need to set up for what you're going to be able to achieve, and realizing that, and I'll use swimming as an example, some of our top Olympic swimmers that may have 2 or 3 medal chances are swimming 12 to 15 times within that meet in an 8-day period.
Yeah.
So optimizing their recovery post-heats, post-semis is absolutely critical, and some of the strategies we've talked about today
completely
can be used.
It's not necessarily the one-off race athlete that's going to win the Olympics. It's the one that's strongest after 3 or 4 rounds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So important to consider. Okay, so we've talked about optimizing recovery. We've talked about over-recovering as a possibility to blunt adaptation. I'm going to give you the last word. Trent, what's the primary message you want people to remember after listening to this podcast?
So that's a evil question, Gord, because it's hard to sum up an entire 57-minute interview with one line. But I guess the take-home message is recovery can be a very effective tool for a coach to get the absolute maximum out of their athlete. Like training, coaches need to become more and more aware of the different modalities that they have for recovery. More is not always better. Sometimes less at certain times of the year is important. And it needs to be part of your strategic plan to get the most out of your athletes.
Thanks, Trent.
Yeah, thank you.